little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Welcome, Talk Catholic, the website.com, your host, Tim Kilcoyne. No agendas here, just the straight and narrow, through Mary to Jesus, the Catholic faith proclaimed and preserved. Hope to see you here every week. Tim Kilcoyne at Christmas. Merry Christmas. And it is the Christmas show, TalkCatholic.com. I wanted to go on a tour today of Christmas memories and perhaps unknown stats and little tidbits of info. And we'll sneak in a story or two. And we'll add to those stories next week for our New Year's show. But I think it's so important, ladies and gentlemen, to appreciate Christmas, one has to remember certainly one's own childhood, but the childhood of many others, going back 100 years. And I think that's exactly what I'm going to do. But I'll focus on 3 decades in particular to get us started: the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. I've got some great books here, one called Christmas Miscellany, another Christmas Memories, another one, Chicken Soup for the Soul, Time for Christmas, 101 Tales of Holiday Joy, Love, and Gratitude. I've got a whole mishmash library of beautiful Christmas books, and that's also to be part of the joy of Christmas is reading a good Christmas book. And I also have to draw the correlation, ladies and gentlemen, between what makes Christmas so beautiful is, in fact, its unchanging nature. There's something about Christmas that's a constant. And no matter how wacky and crazy the world has been, it seems like Christmas is the one thing we can hold on to that really doesn't change. Well, I got news for you. The Catholic faith doesn't either. It's a beautiful thing. So let's enjoy a little bit of a nostalgic tour down Christmas memory lane as I start with Christmas Memories by Susan Waggoner. We start in the 1920s. For most boys, electric trains were an item of breathless fascination, though many youngsters knew they could not hope for one. Even if their home had electricity, a simple set with an engine and a few cars was still quite expensive. Most boys were willing to settle for wooden or metal cars, tractors, and trains that could be pushed or pulled the old-fashioned way. Cowboy and Indian paraphernalia, toy soldiers, miniature farm sets, and building toys such as Lincoln Logs and erector sets were also popular. New to the scene was the pogo stick. Introduced at the beginning of the decade, it was an instant hit and soon became a nationwide craze. How about the cost of Christmas in the 1920s? A string of 16 colored lights were $3.50. Butter per pound, 55 cents. A men's silk tie, 47 cents. A Victrola record player with mahogany stand, $75. A sled, $3.75 to $6. A Cocker Spaniel puppy, $20. And an electric train set, $7.50 and up. Fishing rod and tackle set, $15. Wrapping a package in the 20s was no easy matter. In fact, it was a downright medieval endeavor full of setbacks and frustration, all for one simple reason. It was a world without Scotch tape. Hard to imagine, isn't it? To secure the wrapping paper and hold the ends in place, small seals were used. Usually about 1 inch square, the tiny seals were gummed on one side while the other side sported colorful pictures, candles, poinsettias, snowmen, reindeer, and the like. To secure your package, you had to lick the seal's gum side, hold it in place until it stuck, and hope it didn't fall off while you were tying on the ribbon. Wrapping paper of the 20s was quite luxurious. It often came in coordinated sets with embossed seals, gift tags, and tasseled cord. Many papers were foiled and incorporated metallic elements into the design. Strong tones, deep crimson, bronze, and even black and white were popular, as were geometric patterns such as diamonds, squares, and plaids. Modern gift wrap, or gift dressing as it was then called, had been born and became a well-established staple of the holiday season. In 1923, a Christmas tree complete with lights appeared on the White House lawn for the first time. Several thousand turned out to watch. Other cities followed suit, decorating main streets and town squares with lights, wreaths, and greenery. For many people, electricity was still a novelty, and whether the tree was on the White House lawn or in the public square of their own small town, it was worth venturing out to see. Going downtown became a popular pastime, and stores made sure there was plenty on view. Hoping to garner holiday sales, stores did everything they could to draw customers, from creating windows that told elaborate stories to sponsoring contests to holding parades that ended by pure circumstance at the store's main entrance. For most immigrants, Christmas was a link between the old world and the new. Many of the traditions were familiar, and those that weren't were embraced with all the more enthusiasm for being American. In the early 1920s, many Macy's employees were foreign-born residents who shared memories of the traditional processions that marked European festivals. Advertised as a surprise New York will never forget, the first parade was Macy's Christmas Parade. It stepped off smartly on November 27, 1924. It included 4 marching bands, Mother Goose characters atop horse-drawn floats, hundreds of Macy's employees dressed as clowns, cowboys, knights, and sheiks, and over 24 camels, elephants, donkeys, and goats from the Central Park Zoo. When Santa's sleigh arrived at the end of the procession, a trumpet was sounded, and at Santa's signal, the holiday windows were unveiled. This time, ladies and gentlemen, as you might know, was called the Roaring Twenties, but then, on October 29, 1929, the stock market still managed to close at $230, far above the low of $41 that would take another 2.5 years to reach. Not everyone felt the pinch of hard times right away, but for those who lost their jobs early on, the fall was swift and hard. Unemployment insurance did not exist, and few people had enough to live on their savings. For most people, the Christmas tree remained the one must-have of the holiday season, to be decorated in the grandest style possible. The paper ornaments of yesterday have become a bit shabby by now, not only worn but outdated as well. But tinsel and ornaments remained in style, and thanks to Woolworths, most people could afford at least a few items to make the tree sparkle. We're now in the 1930s. Although electricity remained an expensive item, most rural areas still lacked service. Improvements in technology and design made tree lights more appealing than ever. Strings used less electricity, burned-out bulbs could be more easily replaced, and beads and clips helped to keep the lights in place. There were bell-shaped lights, faceted cones, and rosettas, and stars in which the bulb was surrounded by points of glass or metal. But the biggest innovation, which would become a permanent part of Christmas, was tie-ins to popular characters in the culture. Mickey and Minnie Mouse, Popeye, and his gang were all produced during this decade. The popularity of Santa Claus, firmly established in the 20s, continued to grow through the 30s. Although Santa had been used to attract children into stored toy departments before, the trend went big in the 30s. Soon, no self-respecting town was without at least one store where Santa held court, sitting on a throne-like chair as children lined up to tell him their Christmas wishes. If the store was large, he often occupied his own special toy town within it, with elves to attend him as he went about his business. Before the decade was out, the Men in Red had formed their own national association, and the first school for professional Santas had opened. Over the course of a week, prospective Santas learned salesmanship and showmanship, got instructed in the ups and downs of child psychology, and were brought up to date on the season's most desirable toys. During the 30s, Santa was a one-man WPA, employing thousands of men at relatively good wages, if only for a few weeks a year. People did not stop sending cards during the Depression, or even revert to the less expensive Christmas postcard. Instead, the postcard continued to fade from the scene and soon vanished altogether, while cards grew more imaginative than ever before. These purchase cards remain the most common way of saying Merry Christmas, especially in an era when phone calls to those even a few miles away could be expensive long-distance affairs. Cards of the era embraced a broad range of motifs. English country themes were still popular, though the colors were bolder and brighter. Many cards reflected the longing for a happy, secure world, glamorous women shopping and putting up wreaths as if they'd never heard the word depression. Houses drowsing under blankets of snow, cozy fireplaces, and cheerful pups abounded. Gifts during the 1930s focused on the practical. Clothes, personal items, toys that would not break. It was a time when people did not pin their big hopes for the year on the holiday. new socks or slippers, a pretty tablecloth, a tin of pipe tobacco, something made by hand and given with love. For most adults, these gifts were enough. Homemade gifts were especially common in this decade. Aprons, monogrammed hankies, embroidered dresser scarves, and pillowcases were all given and received with appreciation for the time that went into them. The one gift a family might consider splurging on during the decade was a radio. In the 1920s, the appliance was considered so expensive that radio tubes, rather than radios themselves, were advertised as affordable gifts. By the 30s, however, manufacturers were making less expensive tabletop models, a streamlining much like going from the living room console stereo of the 60s to the boombox of later years. Penny for penny, the radio was the news and entertainment buy of the century, carrying everything from farm and weather reports in the morning to soap operas during the day and WQPH radio. I got carried away. Mysteries, comedies, and quiz shows at night with the president's fireside chats thrown in as a bonus. Not to have a radio is to live in gray isolation, to put your children at a disadvantage at school, and to find yourself out of the loop when people made jokes about Fibber McGee's closet. The radio told you what was on sale downtown, provided recipes and household hints, and kept you informed about events around the world. More than any other single item, the radio, even if it had to be paid for an installment, made the unbearable depression easier to bear. And now we shift to the 1940s. Christmas during the war wasn't so much characterized by what you saw, but by what you didn't see. In December 1941, stores had few shoppers as the shock of Pearl Harbor redirected everyone's attention and cast a shadow over the nation. That year, too, people were wary of an attack on the mainland. On the West Coast, the San Francisco Chronicle instructed citizens to turn off both house lights and Christmas lights when away from home in case a blackout was declared. In subsequent years, as America adjusted to being at war, people decorated and shopped again, so much so that whatever was in the windows or in the stores was often obscured by a tide of humanity. The war had created thousands of jobs and pockets were flush for the first time in years. Shortages may have reduced the amount of things to buy, but people shopped anyway and celebrated Christmas as forcefully as ever. After the war ended, though the mood shifted, it took a while for Christmas to get up and running again. There were still shortages of goods and there was a cramped housing market that would take years to catch up with demand. Economic recession, though it never happened, was a real concern. Many chose to forego a lavish Christmas in favor of saving their money or sending gifts of food and clothing to decimated Europe. Most families simply wanted to be together again. Old decorations and traditions would do just fine. During this time, I think this particular letter, and many of them like this, captured the spirit of the times. Christmas 1944 won't be a merry one, honey. I can't be happy without you. But I shan't be too unhappy if I have some recent mail from you and you are all right. As for you, dear, I hope all of your packages got there before Christmas. I hope you have a decent place to sleep and decent food to eat, and don't be too lonely, dear. Remember that this is positively our first and last Christmas that we aren't going to be together. Think of all we've had, and just think of all we have to look forward to. Years of happiness, and each year better than the last. Evelyn Alvery to her husband, Robert. Christmas greetings took on heightened meaning during the war. Evelyn Alvery's husband kept his wife's letter with him until his safe return at the end of the war. For him and millions of others, wartime cards were treasured as love tokens, charms against danger, and promissory notes for happiness to come. During the war, millions of people relocated and many never returned to their hometowns. Christmas letters of the type we know today, with updates on the family's progress during the year, became increasingly common. This was the future that had been dreamed of for so long, and people were eager to share it. But after the war, things began to look up. In 1946, Lionel bought 16 pages in Liberty magazine to run their entire Christmas catalog. Liberty, recognizing a good thing, promptly added a cover featuring trains, and the issue sold thousands of extra copies. In some cities, electric trains became a scarcity all over again because every available set had been sold. The quality of the toys also improved, returning to pre-war standards, and new toys were once again invented. The Nina Ballerina doll was a huge hit in 1949, and Scrabble, Cootie, Clue, and Candyland all debuted in the post-war years. Even more important than movies was the popular music of the era. Songs did double duty during the war. First, they were entertaining in themselves, and soldiers could listen to their favorite songs on armed forces radio. More than that, music helped bridge the distance between home and away. A girl in Portland, Oregon, listening to In the Mood, could remember dancing to it with her fiancé and know that her fiancé far away would have the same memory when the song was played. Songs of the decade were rich with melody and sentiment. By far the most popular was White Christmas, which debuted in 1942 and quickly became the most requested song in the history of Armed Forces Radio. It was followed by I'll Be Home for Christmas, 1943, Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas, 1944, Let It Snow, 1945, and The Christmas Song, 1946. Post-war Christmas music became distinctly more lighthearted. It's a Marshmallow World, Here Comes Santa Claus, All I Want for Christmas is My Two Front Teeth, and Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer drove the point home. Pun intended. This is WQPH Radio 89.3 FM, and on the other side, we'll shift gears a little bit to particular artifacts and info that you will find under your tree this year. Let us especially remember those 300,000 children down on the border still missing. We honor you, and we pray that you may return to your family. What child is this? Now, for the second part of our show, before we finish with a story, I look at the book Christmas Miscellany, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Christmas, Jonathan Green, the author. And there's a section in the book called Did You Know? Let's read a few of these. Each of the three gifts given to the Christ child by the wise men had symbolic significance. Gold was a symbol of kingship and glory, but also of Christ's divinity. Frankincense, as the perfume used in ritual worship, stood for both purity and ascending prayer and spoke of Christ's Godhead and godliness. Myrrh, the fragrant burial ointment, was a symbol of Christ's mortality, foretelling his death on the cross and ultimately his resurrection. Did you know? In Russia in 1998, two icons associated with Tsar Nicholas II were reported as streaming myrrh, letting off a gentle flow of it each day. When this curious phenomenon was investigated further, Both icons were found to have once been kept at a church dedicated to St. Nicholas. Did you know the American national Christmas tree is in Kings Canyon in California? It is a still living giant sequoia rather than a fir, and it has a name. It's called the General Grant tree and is almost 300 feet tall. The first decorative electric lights used to embellish a Christmas tree were those displayed in the home of one of the vice presidents of Thomas A. Edison's electric company in the 1880s. By 1909, you could buy light bulbs in the shape of Santa or a snowman, although now familiar flame-shaped bulbs did not appear until the 1920s. Most households, however, couldn't actually afford to buy fairy lights until after the Second World War. Here's a little background for the Christmas stocking. According to the Italian legend of La Befana, the three wise men stopped at her home on their way to pay homage to the Christ child and invited her to go with them. But La Befana had lost her own child to plague and found the prospect of seeing another baby too upsetting. But after the three wise men had left, she changed her mind. She set off in pursuit of them, but never found the Magi again. Instead, every time she came across a good child's stocking, she filled it with toys and sweets in an effort to make up for her foolishness. This one's very beautiful. Did you know the Cherry Tree Carol is an example of a carol that tells a story relating to the as-yet unborn Christ child? It recounts an apocryphal story of the Virgin Mary. While traveling to Bethlehem, Mary and Joseph stop at a cherry orchard. Mary asks her husband to pick cherries for her, blaming her unborn son for this sudden craving. Joseph rather cruelly tells her to let the child's father pick her cherries. At that moment, Jesus speaks from the womb and commands the cherry tree to lower a branch down to his mother, which it subsequently does. Joseph, in a state of shock, is immediately repentant. During the mid-19th century, American composers wrote such carols as Away in a Manger and Kings of Orient, which in turn influenced the ancient tradition of carol singing on this side of the pond. The name Bethlehem, did you know? In the carol O Little Town of Bethlehem and Jesus' birthplace is an Arabic word meaning house of bread. Did you know? It is traditional among many families for each child to receive a tangerine in their stocking along with other presents. One of the oldest varieties is the Dancy tangerine, which has a loose, pliable peel. The tangerine used to be considered an exotic fruit, and it was available only in December. It made the perfect Christmas treat for children to receive from Father Christmas. There is also a legend that the tradition was started by 12th century French nuns who left socks full of fruit, nuts, and tangerines at the houses of the poor. Did you know the vibrantly colored poinsettia, with its bright red leaves that has become such a Christmas institution, is named after the first American ambassador to Mexico, Dr. Joel Roberts Poinsett. In Mexico, the plant goes by the name of the flower of the Holy Night, but when Poinsett brought it back to America, it was renamed in his honor. In Mexico, the plant has legendary origins that are associated with Christmas. It was once the tradition in that country to place gifts for Jesus on church altars on Christmas Eve. One poor boy had nothing to give and in his distress knelt outside the church window and prayed. And there, where he had been kneeling, a beautiful plant with red leaves sprang up. The town of Encinitas in California is known as the poinsettia capital of the world because of the profusion of plants found there. Did you know that in many households it is still traditional to eat fish on Christmas Eve? This custom arose during the Middle Ages. It was traditional to eat fish on a Friday because Friday was a day of abstinence when the Catholic Church prohibited the consumption of meat, and this is not uncommon today. For Catholics, the night of December 24th is the vigil of the Nativity, and as such is a fast. That being the case, meat is not to be eaten at this time either. However, our medieval forebears did not consider fish to be meat, and so the fish dish was permissible. And did you know, and this might put the last 3 years of madness into perspective as a time when the state makes overreach into the church? Well, history does indeed repeat itself, ladies and gentlemen. Attempts by the Puritan government to stop people publicly celebrating Christmas and to force shops and businesses to stay open instead led to violent confrontations between supporters and opponents of Christmas in many towns. December 25th became a typically dreary day of everyday work and fasting. For 18 barren years, England was officially a country without Christmas. However, although Christmas celebrations were banned, They did not die out. Instead, they went underground until 1660. Despite the risks, people held secretive religious services marking Christ's birth and also maintained the secular aspects of the day. Well, whether we start in the catacombs or the pandemic, Christmas, ladies and gentlemen, lives because of these little stories that go on and on and on. And may we finish now with another story that will never cease from being told. Clark Moore's popular poem, an account of a visit from St. Nicholas, we are told. The stockings were hung by the chimney with care in the hope that St. Nicholas would soon be there. And indeed, this tradition has its origins in one of the myths surrounding the original Santa Claus himself, St. Nicholas. The legend can be traced back to the 8th century and involves a father and his 3 daughters. This family had fallen on hard times and could no longer afford even the basics such as food and clothing. There was certainly no way that the poor man could afford the dowries that the girls would need to get married. Faced with such a dire predicament, the girls' father decided that the only option left open to them to save them from starvation was for the girls to enter into the world's oldest profession. One night, however, St. Nicholas happened to be passing the house where the family lived, and he heard the father and his daughters bemoaning their desperate situation. Nicholas had been left a considerable fortune by his parents, but now there were only 3 bags of gold left. No matter, it was enough to help the distraught spinsters. Having collected the cash from his home, Nicholas returned later that night. One by one, he dropped the bags of gold down the chimney, where they landed in the girls' stockings that had been hung up to dry in front of the fire. And so the daughters were saved from a life of iniquity and poverty. As a consequence, the hanging out of the stockings on Christmas Eve is one of the older traditions that have become linked to the modern commercial Christmas. And may I simply say that many miracles have taken place by prayers to St. Nicholas in the last couple of years. I think we'll do a whole new show in 2025 on this. 2 wonderful women closest to me, the owner of this radio station, Marianne, and my sister Julie. 2 recipients of great miracles by San Damiano water, St. Francis's intercession, Our Lady Mystical Rose, and indeed, miracles happen, ladies and gentlemen. I pray for you this Christmas from WQPH Radio, 89.3 FM. Feliz Navidad. Let your light shine. That is what it's all about here at WQPH Radio, 89.3 FM. But we need to hear your story. You want your voice to be his voice. That is making the faith known to others. Please, my number is 877-625-3727. Tim Kilcoyne, TalkCatholic.com. St. Mother Teresa told us, your ministry is your work right where you are. Grab on to this microphone. God bless.